So it does look like the cyclical peak earnings. So when companies that have business cycles, which is sort of a old school term, some of you guys have never even seen a business cycle, which is hilarious. We used to say that in 2000. In 2000, we used to say, oh, you kids have never seen a bear market. And oftentimes it was true. And so a company like Caterpillar is called cyclical. What does that mean? It's pretty simple. Their earnings kind of look like this. And what's interesting is break even can be here, which means that they actually lose money in some years. But overall, hopefully they have positive net earnings. So what you try to do is you average an entire cycle. You say, okay, what's the PE of this? What's the PE of this? And because you can sort of say, well, that you could say is it sort of equivalent. This is still the break even. You could sort of reframe that as just the area under the curve if you normalized it for those two. So, maybe another way to look at it could be, let's say this is, again, this break even. You might have something like this, or hopefully you start to have higher cyclical peak earnings and maybe even have a situation where you don't lose money as your company grows. So that's sort of one way to do it. No, I think trailing 12 months isn't necessarily good for cyclical. You want to sometimes even do 5-year earnings or more, because you want to capture both parts of the cycle, the high earnings part and the low earnings part. So Caterpillar is extremely cyclical. Sarepta is sort of still under siege from some of the issues facing their drug. And you also have an issue with Sarepta because if the FDA is undergoing a large amount of change, well, their drugs technically did not meet the burden for some FDA approvals. So they got approved, of course, we know that. But, they were sort of granted a bit of a special approvals because of the very serious fatal disease, Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So possibly one of these things where does RFK take a second look and say, wait a second, we should have not approved this. Let's unapprove it. I don't know. I doubt it. I don't know who would want to deprive these kids of a medicine that could help them theoretically. Nevertheless, we're in uncharted territory, so I think the market does not like uncertainty, regardless. So you could do, like I said, something called a cyclically adjusted PE ratio, or CAPE, which is surprisingly close to COPE, but it's CAPE. What else did I want to tell you about cyclicals? Yeah, if you haven't seen a bear market in a long time, or a economic downturn in a long time, it's kind of hard to understand this, but you could have negative earnings for several years. So I'm trying to go back and see what the cash flow situation was for these guys, going backwards a bit. yeah, you can see here that at some point, 2020 might have been maybe a cyclical low. You can see that Caterpillar had very, very low net earnings and lower cash flow to still had around 5 billion. So if you do the PE on the cyclical low, it's 30 times earnings. If you do it on the cyclical peak, it's 16 times earnings, which is why I was saying I'm not sure it's cheap. It's still around 20-ish times earnings, and the cyclical growth, you sort of have to look at it cycle over cycle, which, is very, we're very used to looking at earnings and revenue growth year over year. S&P recovering, only down 90 basis points now. Of course, up flirting with 100. And here was like I said, a cyclically good year was 2019. Okay, wasn't that great. Revenue was up a lot, but earnings didn't follow. So only 6 billion free cash flow that year. So kind of looking like Caterpillar's last year or two of performance was a bit of an aberration. Just discussed Sarepta a second ago. It's a rough day for many drug companies as the FDA leadership is being shaken up a bit. Ah, interesting. But they actually do keep the free cash flow. So usually with the interest rates, you get a mix of higher costs as well as higher earnings. But it does appear to correlate fairly well with interest rates. But yeah, it was free cash flow was 5 billion to 6 billion for a while, and then shot up to 10 and 11 billion. But historically, they've also had higher sales too, to be fair. So I think that might explain it maybe even a little better. So they've had both. We all have the eye mites. Ah, look how interesting. We had to go back 12 years. But they did have this cyclical peak, and here's the cyclical trough, and you can actually graph this. Let's chart this. It's kind of funny. You can see the cycle. It took them 11 years to have more cash flow than they had in 2013. It kind of tells you a little bit how these cyclical companies go. And as somebody astutely mentioned, that's why we have a very smart audience. You have sort of a double cycle. You have the financing cycle, and then you have the economic cycle. So they're both cyclical. So you might get like a double cyclical bottom, And in some cases, you might have the cycles kind of offset each other. In some cases, you might have the cycles reinforce each other. Again, here you have the old style, which is you used to pull out the financials out of the 10K and put them in this weird section, which was like the exhibits to the 10K. And that was like the bane of a lot of people's existence, a lot of financial analysts' existence, to do that. But that's how it used to get done way back when, in the ancient times of 2010. Not that long ago. But if you're old school, you gotta, if you want to be serious about finance, you gotta know how they used to do things and how they do things now. You gotta know everything. There's nothing that you can not learn. You gotta learn every company that was in your industry, that used to be in your industry, all the history, because you're gonna talk to these old heads. That's a technical term. I learned it in prison. The old head is just an old person, basically. They're the wise older person. When you talk to the old heads, you gotta be able to talk to them about the companies that existed in their time, because they're using those companies to guide them to understand the current world. And you don't have that benefit because you weren't there. In some cases, you weren't even born yet. So you got to go study the old, my brother and I have an old joke between us, inside joke. We say you have to study the tapes. Comes from wrestling. But you really do have to go study the tape, the old tape. Read old 10Qs and 10Ks. That's why I actually spent a good chunk of my weekend processing this data set of old dead companies, dead stocks that have been removed. They were removed a long time ago from the S&P 500. I'm sorry, removed a long time ago from all data sets. These were just old stocks that went delisted and defunct, and almost no system has them, including Bloomberg. And so we're loading those into Godel. Because it's important, if you're going to study bubbles, for example, quantum stocks are in a bubble, you want to see, well, how long did other bubbles last? And to do that, the first stock I thought of was some of these old internet stocks. But to my chagrin, I couldn't find them on my system, which makes sense because we were just starting Godel. But I took a peek at some of our rival systems. I couldn't find them there either. They're not on Yahoo Finance. They're not on TradingView. They're not even on Bloomberg. So I was upset by this because I want to go see what that looks like. If I remember it correctly, how did some of these old stocks trade way back when? And so I found the data sets, so we're going to be putting them back. And then the same thing applies in news. A lot of these news sources go back 10 years or 5 years, and we want to be able to go back 20 or 30 years. Anyway, here's the chart of Caterpillar's free cash flow, and this is going back to 2010. So you had this very erratic cycle here, and this kind of bigger cycle. So do we go back down to 7 billion or 5 billion in earnings? If we do, that could mean, the stock's trading at 30 times. And with cyclical stocks, you just don't know. You just never know. And this is why semiconductors are, you might say, what does Caterpillar have to do with semiconductors? A lot. Shockingly, a lot. Semiconductors, you can think of as cyclical machinery for microelectronics. When you need 10 tractors and you've only got 5, you order 5 tractors. And if you're sitting at Caterpillar, you just got 5 orders from 80 different places or 100 different places. Okay, great. You sell the tractors. And then you call the same customer a year later and you say, hey, do you guys want more tractors? He says, sure, this year we need 8. Fantastic. and you sell them 8. And you give them a call next year and you say, how many tractors do you want this year? 10? He said, John, it's been a bad year. You saw the tariffs, you saw the unemployment. He said, okay, so do you want 8? I said, John, I'm not ordering any. And John, the salesman at Caterpillar says, what? But the guys, the factory, we made assuming you would order 10 or 12 or something. You're telling me you're not going to order any? He said, yeah, business isn't, we don't think business is going to be that good. So John's sitting there like, oh my God. And then he calls the sales guy next to him and said, John, Mike, I think I'm going to get fired. I said, John, why? I'm not going to make my sales quota. Mike laughs and he says, I'm not making my sales quota either. And they wait, and the next year comes around. He says, any chance you're going to order any tractors this year? The guy says, no, the economy's still pretty rotten. And then a year passes, and he says, how about this year? He says, I'll order 2. And that's the cycle. That's how it happens. And the same exact thing happens in semiconductors.